I am going to get straight to the point, no introductions. The operating system GNU/Linux. Why the GNU should be included? I will tell you the reasons that I have come up with. First, the original idea, why is it GNU? Well, you see, it is the GNU operating system that Richard Stallman started in the 1980s. He had the goal to create a fully free operating system called GNU, and then later in the 1990s the Linux kernel was made and attached to the GNU operating system. The incomplete GNU operating system at the time, so as to create the GNU/Linux operating system. Which means that it's the GNU operating system that existed well before the Linux did, combined with the Linux kernel, which makes the GNU operating system include. It's the GNU/Linux operating system, but it's still the GNU operating system too, right? It's the GNU operating system and it uses the Linux kernel, so calling it GNU/Linux is appropriate. Although I like to say just GNU occasionally. But yeah, including the GNU is obviously important. Now, the arguments people have against including the GNU are things such as the kernel is important and it's the most important part of the operating system. And some might say that it is an operating system, that the kernel alone is an operating system. So that's what I will be responding to now. The idea that the Linux kernel itself is an operating system. Therefore, disregarding the GNU in the name is valid because the GNU is not an operating system, only the Linux itself is an operating system. I have a counter-argument to that argument. You see, Linux alone is not an operating system. The way I see it is that an operating system is the software which lets the user interact with the computer, to use the computer basically. So, an operating system, it handles the hardware and it allocates memory and it handles and manages the applications and it does all of that. That's the kernel. A kernel is a part of the operating system, but an operating system, a full operating system, also includes all of the software that the basic software that the user requires to interact with the computer, to use the computer. Because a computer, it doesn't use itself, it has to be used by someone. So an operating system is this software that allows the user to use the computer. So basically the core utilities and things like that, that's what the operating system is. So both the kernel and the rest of the operating system, they all complete the operating system. All of them are required to make an operating system. One part alone is not an operating system. Linux, the kernel, it is one part of the operating system. According to many people, or some people, I don't really know the specific amount of those people, but some people say that Linux alone is an operating system. I disagree. Linux is a kernel. A kernel is the part of the operating system which I first described, the one that manages the hardware and manages the hardware and it does the stuff, allocates memory, the I/O, and that what the kernel does, the low-level stuff, broadly. So that's what the kernel does. Kernel is a part of the operating system, but a full operating system, the way I see it is that the full operating system, it includes all of the software that the user requires as well. Because it's not really an operating system if it cannot be used by the user. It's not really much of an operating system. Linux alone cannot be used by the user. Linux alone is quite useless. So that's the way I see it. Let me give you a few examples. the BSD operating systems, they are not just the kernel. BSD, let's say FreeBSD as an example, FreeBSD includes more than just the kernel, right? There is more to FreeBSD than just the kernel. It is a complete operating system. It has more stuff inside of itself than just the kernel. The kernel is a part of it, yes, and it is an important part of it. But it's not just the kernel that makes a FreeBSD. It has more stuff to it than just the kernel. The same applies to any other proprietary software operating system as well, such as the Microsoft Windows. It has a kernel too, and the rest of the operating system. A kernel is also important to the Windows operating system, but the Windows operating system is not the same as the kernel. A kernel is a part of it. So, also, what I would like to say is that there is this operating system standard called POSIX. I don't know how it's pronounced, that's how it's written. So, the POSIX, it defines an operating system. It has a set of standards, and it has a bunch of standards that an operating system has to follow to be a POSIX compliant operating system. So, POSIX compliant. That means that the operating system is compatible with any other POSIX compliant operating system. So, the POSIX is a standard for a full operating system, is it not? It is. POSIX defines a full operating system. So, if an operating system follows the POSIX standard, then it is a POSIX compliant operating system. It is a full operating system. The Linux kernel alone is not an operating system which follows or it's not an operating system at all, but it's not a POSIX compliant operating system. The Linux kernel is not a POSIX compliant operating system. Linux is a part of one, or can be used as a part of a POSIX compliant operating system. But Linux alone is not. Now, of course, POSIX is not the only possible operating system that could exist out there. It's just an example of one. But POSIX is a good example of what I see as being an operating system, of what I see an operating system should be, or what it is. The Linux kernel, it is a part of the operating system. Right. So, I would also like to bring up the idea that a lot of people, or again, some people say that Linux can be used without GNU. So that somehow means that the GNU Linux distributions are not GNU Linux distributions, that they are just Linux. Because the idea that they say is that Linux can be used without GNU, so therefore GNU is useless, irrelevant, it doesn't matter. So only the Linux matters, because it can be used without GNU. To that I say, so who cares? It's irrelevant. Sure, Linux can be used without the GNU, but why should that matter? It just means that you can take one part of the operating system and put it to another operating system. It doesn't mean that the GNU somehow just vanishes. The example they like to bring out is like the BusyBox, for example. Like distributions which do not have any GNU utilities, none, absolutely none. And they only have the Linux and no GNU software at all. Now, obviously that's not a GNU operating system, that is not a GNU. That has nothing to do with GNU. It does have Linux, it does have the Linux kernel. But if it uses like whatever the BusyBox stuff and whatever nonsense, well then maybe you should call it whatever BusyBox Linux or something. Now, I'm not sure on that one because I am not familiar with these non-GNU Linux using operating systems. I am not familiar with them, so I cannot comment on them, but that is just an example. And then the operating systems which run GNU software with Linux, that's GNU/Linux. Or just GNU Linux. No need to mention the slash. Just GNU Linux. GNU+Linux is an operating system which uses the GNU software and the Linux kernel. And whatever BusyBox Linux is an operating system which uses the Linux and BusyBox whatever nonsense. Again, I'm not familiar with the BusyBox operating system, so I cannot say how that works. You figure that out for yourself, I don't know. I'm not familiar with the BusyBox stuff. But if it is just the same thing, then whatever. The point I'm making here is that, that BusyBox stuff, that's just an example. It doesn't have to be BusyBox, it could be anything. Anyway, the point I'm making is that the fact that the Linux kernel can be used outside of GNU, it doesn't matter. You see, the next argument that I'm going to say illustrates this perfectly. See, the Linux kernel is to an operating system what an engine is to a car, basically. I mean, that's a pretty good example, an analogy. That's pretty good analog. That is a pretty good analog. You see, the Linux kernel, it's like the engine. So let's imagine an engine. Let's call it Linux. The engine can be used by any car. You could create a car which has no engine and then put the Linux kernel in there. Now obviously the car has to be compatible with the engine. Not any car could run with the Linux kernel, but as long as it's compatible with the Linux engine, then you could build a car which uses the Linux engine, right? So any car which is compatible with the Linux engine, you can use the Linux engine on. So GNU is one of these cars that can run the Linux engine, right? If we have a car without an engine, that's the GNU, and then we have the engine, that's the Linux. When you put them together, that's the GNU Linux car. It's the complete, fully functional car, right? The question is then, what do you call this car? Do you call it Linux because it uses the Linux engine? I wouldn't. I would still call it the GNU car, which just happens to run the Linux kernel. Or I could also, I probably would also like to respect the Linux kernel as well, so call it GNU Linux, because it's the GNU car and it uses the Linux kernel, so call it GNU Linux, to respect the Linux engine. But mainly, it's just the GNU car, right? You could take the Linux kernel out, or engine in this case, and put in some other engine like herd. You could just as well run the GNU car with a herd engine, right? It is still the GNU car. See this analog about the cars? It's really perfect. It perfectly illustrates my point. GNU is the car, which has no engine. Linux is the kernel, the engine. Linux is the engine. Linux the kernel is the engine you can use in the GNU car. But you can also use any other kernel as the engine in the car. Right? So that's my argument here, or a good analog of my argument, that you wouldn't call the car just Linux. It's the GNU car, which uses the Linux kernel. This perfectly, or very perfectly, very close to perfectly, translates to the operating systems. The GNU is the operating system, and then Linux is a kernel that the operating system uses. Just like how the car uses the engine, the operating system uses the Linux. The GNU Linux operating system uses the Linux kernel. So, what about the other cars, the BusyBox things? Well then that's another car. That's a BusyBox car, and it can also run the Linux engine. You can put the Linux engine in both the GNU car and the BusyBox car. BusyBox car and GNU car, those are two different cars, right? They are two different vehicles. The BusyBox vehicle and the GNU vehicle, they are two different things. You can use the Linux engine on both. You can also use the herd kernel on the GNU car. Right, so that's how it works. That's really a pretty good analog, I think. And yeah, of course, then all of the other software that the operating system has, they could be any of the accessories that the car has. Maybe it has different types of seats inside. Maybe you could have some you could add some customizations to your car, add in new software, new stuff. You could add in a cup holder into your car or something. But it's still the GNU car, right? You have a GNU car which runs the Linux kernel. You can add in your cup holders and your stuff, your decorations. You can add all of this stuff in, but it is still the GNU car and it runs the Linux kernel. So, GNU+Linux it is. Or just GNU, because it is the GNU car. But for the sake of respecting the Linux, call it GNU+Linux. But it's the GNU car, which runs the Linux kernel. Right, so that is my argument. The car analog, I like it because it is pretty good. It does represent. I'm quite confident that this analog does accurately represent what's going on. The examples of the cup holders and the decorations you can add into the car, they perfectly translate to you customizing your operating system and adding in stuff, right? You can install your own applications and you can decorate your operating system by installing all these themes and icons or other software, any software really. Also, because it's your car, you can also take a part of it out and replace it with another. So that would translate as you removing some software in the operating system and then replacing it with something else, some other piece of software. You could take out the seat and replace it with another. All right, you can customize the GNU car, but it's still the GNU car. Eventually, when you customize it a lot, it does sort of bring this Theseus ship thing, or whatever was it called actually. Was it called the Theseus ship, where you have the ship on an ocean and you replace all of its parts? Then at what point does it stop being the same ship? At what point does it change into the new ship? It really does bring up these weird philosophical questions when you customize the car a lot. But still, it is effectively still the same car, right? It is the GNU car. The GNU car you have. You can customize it, you can use the Linux engine, or you can also use the Herd engine alternatively. The Herd engine might suck. It may be a bad engine, but that doesn't mean it's not an engine. It still runs. It's still an engine, right? So that translates to the software world as in the Herd kernel. It may be bad quality. It might crash. It might have some bugs, but it's still a kernel, right? It is a kernel. Herd is a kernel, and even if it sucks, it's still a kernel, and you can use it with the GNU operating system, just like you can use the Herd engine in your GNU car. I think this is a pretty good explanation of my argument. What would you call the GNU car? I would call it GNU. Or, to respect the Linux engine, call it GNU+Linux. What would you call it? Would you call it just Linux? Why? It makes about as much sense to call the operating system just Linux as it makes sense to call the entire car just Linux. I mean, just think about it. Really think about it, honestly. Honestly think about it. Forget all of your cognitive dissonance, forget all of that. Honestly think about it. What would you call the car? It is the GNU car made by the GNU people. Maybe they used someone else's software as some parts of the car. Maybe it has tires from someone else. Right? They borrowed someone else's tires to make the GNU car or something like that. But it does not have an engine. You put the Linux engine in. What would you call the car? Does it somehow become just Linux? The entire car, it's only Linux now. Because you put the Linux kernel in. The Linux engine in this case. in this analog. You put the Linux engine in. Does it suddenly just... Does the entire car suddenly become just Linux? I don't think so. It is still the GNU car, right? Think about it. Honestly, think about it. Think about it honestly. Ignore your political views about what you think of free software and proprietary software and open source. Ignore all of that. Just think about it. It is a car. The GNU car. It may borrow some components from someone else, but it's still composed by, it's still made by the GNU, right? It's the GNU car. It's a unique GNU car. And then you put the Linux engine in. What do you call the car? I call it the GNU car, because it's the GNU car. If I want to pay respect to the engine, then I can call it the GNU+Linux car. Right, that's my argument here. Both are valid ways to call the operating system. Just GNU or GNU+Linux. But never just Linux, because Linux alone is just the kernel. Just like with the engine of a car. The engine alone is not a car, is it? It's an engine. It is an important part of a car, yes. And a car wouldn't go anywhere without an engine, yes, that's true. But the engine alone is not a car. It's not a car, it's an engine, right? Don't call the engine a car. It's not a car, it's just an engine. You can put it in a car, and you can use that car with the engine. But the engine alone is not a car. It's the same thing with the operating system. The Linux kernel is a kernel. It's not an operating system, it is a kernel. Right. Just think about it. Honestly think about it. Forget the politics and whatever. Just think about it honestly. What would you call the car? I think you should call it the GNU car, because that's what it is. It's the GNU car. At least that's my opinion. Now, that's it for my speech, I guess. Thanks for listening or whatever. Comments and responses could be appreciated wherever you hear this. If that's an option, if that's something you can do, then feel free to comment. Right. So, thanks for listening. Until next time, bye.